Good morning, church. I'm going to stay up here for the sermon because I got a bit of a throat situation and I don't want to be breathing on that front row. So let us say a word of prayer together. O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing to you. Amen. So this morning we have started a new sermon series entitled Home. And it begins today in Genesis with the earliest verses of the Abraham story, and it will finish on Homecoming Sunday, September 17th. See what we did there? This series aims to explore more deeply not a book or a person of the Bible, but a concept of the Bible, the concept of home. To begin the series, we go to the beginning of Hebrew history. Actually, this morning's reading came from Genesis 12, not Genesis 1, which is kind of a second beginning of Hebrew history, so to speak. You see, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, from the creation stories to the Tower of Babel, are what biblical scholars call Jewish primeval history. That is to say, the stories are more like mythology than like history. They give an account to why the world is as it is, told of times long before anyone could have witnessed. Like all other ancient civilizations, ancient Israelites developed mythology to explain the unexplainable. But chapter 12, where we started this morning, begins a different kind of history, what scholars call the patriarchal history. A history much closer to the real lives of real people. The story of Abram, who later becomes Abraham, begins the telling of what is no longer just myth, but the family story of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic beginnings. Multiple world religions trace themselves back to Abraham. They are known most generally as the Abrahamic traditions, all to this day still worshiping the one God of Abraham. Jewish tradition and Christian tradition through adoption claims that the 12 tribes of Israel are descended from Abraham through his son Isaac and grandson Jacob. Islamic tradition claims that the 12 Arab tribes, known as the Ishmaelites, are descended from Abraham through his son Ishmael. But we learn this morning that the whole enterprise began with a calling out. God inviting Abram to leave home. Often I think we imagine God's calling as mostly a calling in, right? Being called into community, into discernment, into a spiritual practice, into deeper and deeper relationship. But God calls out sometimes too. God called Hagar out of a situation in which Sarah was making her life miserable. God calls Moses out of Egypt. God called Paul out of his Jewish faith. Sometimes we have to leave something to find where we are supposed to be. Abram's father was named Terah, who we are told in Genesis 11 was from a city the Bible calls Ur of the Chaldeans. And with some fairly convincing archaeology, we can be rather certain that Ur was located in what is now southern Iraq, just northwest of the Persian Gulf. The very end of Genesis 11 tells us, Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Abram's ancestral home was then in the southernmost region of what is known to history as Mesopotamia, or what we call the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent looks like, well, a crescent or a boomerang, if you will, when laid on the map. It travels up from the Persian Gulf, up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to what is today northern Syria or southeastern Turkey, and comes back down the coast of the Mediterranean Sea until you reach the land of Canaan, or what we know today as Israel, Palestine. In the regions of Mesopotamia near Ur, from which Abram's father had left, it is said that not only agriculture, but irrigation, writing, glass production, and even the wheel were all first developed there. So why leave a place that is blossoming with human innovation and culture? Why leave such a place? We aren't told directly why Abram's father decided to leave Ur. We can infer from our passage this morning and from other biblical references that God's calling to Abram was a major motivator. In the book of Joshua, for instance, interestingly, the prophet confirms God's calling of Abraham began not only in Haran, where his father decided to stop their journey, but all the way back home in Ur. It says this: Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your ancestors, Terah and his sons Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many." The ancient historian Josephus gives us another insight into Terah's possible motivations. Josephus writes, "Now Terah, hating Chaldea, or Ur of the Chaldeans, on account of his mourning for his son Haran, they all removed themselves to Haran." You see, Abram was one of three brothers. One of his brothers was named Haran, and Haran had a son Lot, and Haran died before any of them left. I think we can relate to how grief can sometimes drive us away from a place, no? And all the reminders of what one has lost. And so maybe it was that Abram's father believed his son and believed that God had been calling him out and decided to go. Or maybe it was that he just couldn't manage to look at the streets of his hometown without one of his sons alive. We don't really know for sure. But as it tells us in Genesis 11, their plan from the start was to travel all the way from Ur to Canaan. And for some reason that isn't elaborated, they stop halfway in the northern city of Haran, where Terah decides to stay. A final interesting aspect of this story is what Jewish literary tradition says about Abram's father, Terah. Tradition holds that Terah was a craftsman who specialized in making religious idols. Isn't that ironic? The Hebrew word for served can also mean work. Hence the tradition that Terah crafted idols for a living. So some posit that Terah found a good new market for his wares in Haran and decided not to migrate any further, to abandon the journey that God had given to Abram. It's hard to know what is true, and sometimes even harder to know what really matters. My sense is that the biblical history records Abram as the one who heard God and responded for good reason. Despite likely being quite comfortable in Ur and then in Haran, despite his father deciding not to continue their journey with him, Abram continues to move towards the still small voice beckoning him to go even further. I will show you where you will go. So we return again to this question, why leave a place that is blossoming with human innovation and culture? And the answer is that Abram was blossoming in his own right. And there wasn't enough room anymore in Ur or Haran for Abram and all that he would offer the world. Abram needed a new land, a holy land, a land that God will show him. This is the way of human growth and development. A particular place, because of its access to resources and opportunity, begins to gather people in from all the surrounding areas. Communities are formed first as tribes and villages and eventually grow into towns and cities and even empire. Growing until some unrecognized breaking point is reached where too many can no longer find their place, no longer meet their own needs, eventually leading to large numbers of people spilling out of a place, relocating to new places of opportunity, or even finding new ways of being. We need not look too far for a contemporary example of this. Ask folks in Arizona or Utah or Texas or Colorado how they feel about all the Californians moving into town. Actually, don't. It's probably better that you don't. I can't know for sure, but I imagine that Abram's departure from Ur was such a kind of spilling out. And one must wonder, was the resource that Abram left home to find not a material one, but a spiritual one? Genesis 12 enters us into the story at a place where Abram is ready to go. He hears the voice of God making future tense promises. No details yet, mind you, just wild promises. And yet for Abram, it is enough. Without seeming discernment we are told of, Abram prepares his people and his possessions to go. Likely spends the time that was required to convince his father to come with him, and finally leaves home. Yet what is curious for me, what I wonder about, is how Abram came to know and came to trust God in the first place. That's the interesting part for me. It's the part that the Bible stays silent about. It could be very helpful, I think, in our own time, a time of growing secular apathy and moral equivalency, to understand how it was that Abram first developed this lived theology that was so drastically different from anything that any of his neighbors or any known human had considered before. That is to say, how he came to know and love God. Of course, devotion to one God, a God of all. We may be in a time that we too must find our own ways into a new lived theology. That the theologies that we have inherited, the ways that we know God, are beginning to not serve us as well as they need to. For the theology that teaches us that God is always keeping score, God is always evaluating you, that God is able to help in all instances, but sometimes doesn't. That God offers blessings to some and curses to others. These arcane ways of imagining God don't serve us anymore, church. It doesn't serve the world. It doesn't grow our numbers. It doesn't deepen our relationship with God in the least. Despite what any bit of scripture might say or what our religious traditions hold to be true, Abraham knew something that all of us need to take to heart. All that matters is how we respond to the holy, the God in our midst that is calling to us right now. Abram knew it so well, in fact, that he cast aside all other gods and dedicated himself to Yahweh. a thing that would be totally unthinkable in his day. And this monotheistic movement on earth traces back to Abram and his audacity to be made new. The promise God makes to Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, and then to Isaac and to Ishmael, and then to Jacob and to Esau, is that Abraham would be the father of a great nation with many descendants. And let's not forget the biggest promise made to Abraham. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. We're familiar with the promise of a great nation and many descendants. That we know of Abraham, and that turned out to be a promise fulfilled by God. But this promise is sneaky and it's small and we don't pay enough attention to it. Hear it again. In you, Abram, God says, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. There's a phenomenal book published almost 10 years ago by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. It's titled, Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence. And I highly recommend it. It's an easy and important read. And Rabbi Sacks does some masterful scholarship examining the stories of conflict and reconciliation that come from this Abrahamic family tree that we all belong. He does so in an effort to argue that intra-religious conflict and violence in the modern world is still being informed by ancient sibling rivalries. That's how he calls it. Which we can see repeat again and again in the Genesis narrative and are lived out in such horrors as crusades and jihads and inquisitions and pogroms and the Holocaust. So many of our historical pasts have led to violence. So Rabbi Sacks asserts that in sibling relations, one can develop a deep sense of jealousy, a desire to have what the other has, or even to be who the other is. In this case, it is divine blessing and divine privilege that is at stake. Sarah says to Hagar, "Send away this slave woman and her son, for he will not be an heir with my son Isaac." And so it began. So goes the long, violent history of God's children fighting for God's attention and God's love. God promises to Abram, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Well, friends, we are still waiting for that promise to come to fruition. Do we believe that God will still do this? It's a question you have to ask yourself. Do we believe that God will still do this? Because looking around, if we're honest, it seems impossible that centuries of religious war and contempt could still produce such a global state of blessing. A fair argument could be made that Abram's legacy up to today is as much of a curse as it is a blessing. Yet God is steadfastly unpredictable, friends. That's right, steadfastly unpredictable. And will make a way where none seemed to be before. And so I wonder what it would take for the Abrahamic traditions to begin again. Called out of the old ways that we are in now and into new ones, which actually would be a blessing. Something more virtuous and true than we have accepted to this point. A family reunion, if you will. Some religious reality that could be, in fact, a blessing for every family of the earth. I wonder if we are today able or even willing to transform to the degree that Abram was willing to transform. Leave our religious homes, Leave our physical homes, leave the home of our cultural assumptions, the home of our privilege and our comforts in pursuit of God's final promise, a blessing for all people. On earth as it is in heaven, you might say. Some of us won't even leave our pew, let alone our denomination, right? Because it is a hard admission to make that one's own religious system is faltering, that one's own theology is faltering, especially when your identity and maybe even your livelihood is wrapped up in those systems which don't always serve us well and sometimes harm us. And so we seek transformation, which on its surface seems more like a mere adjustment than rather a total upheaval, right? I think we like that word because it feels safe enough that things will simply change rather than come to an end and then a new beginning. It's even harder to be called out of a situation that seems stable and sustaining. That seems to be the choice Abram had to make. For if the Jewish literary narrative is accurate, Abram's father made a comfortable living crafting religious idols. And the market for them was still strong, and so he stayed in Haran despite those initial plans for Canaan. Maybe Terah was willing to be transformed a little. Maybe a new address and such, but being made new? Welcoming the death of one's old self and the formation of a new self, maybe that was just too much to handle. Here at Downey, we speak often of transformation, weekly in fact. Our mission is to be transformed by God's radical love. That in so doing, we might be able, with God's help and in beloved community, to build a more welcoming church, a just society, and a sustainable world. That is our mission. But what truly is this transformation? Is one who has been transformed just a better version of their old self? Or are they in some way wholly new? Is the caterpillar which transforms into a butterfly still in some ways a caterpillar? Or are they a wholly new creation? I don't know the answer. But I do have more questions, like what will it take for the modern world to leave home? What would it take for you to leave home? What would it take for you to set aside all the things you knew that you were so that God could show you what you will be? Abandoning our sense of superiority and divine favor for a humble spirit, learning and growth. Opening our ears to hear the true calling of God, not simply the words we want God to say. Could we each set down our holy books in favor of holy conversations? Could we forgive the atrocities of our ancestors for the sake of future healing? Can we hear God speaking to us today, not only from Christian mouths, but Jewish mouths and Islamic mouths too? Is God big enough to use anyone and everyone to move us in the directions we need to go? Abram left everything behind and chose to follow God's lead. And if humanity is to see this last promise realized, that Abraham would be a blessing to all of humanity, it is my sense that we will be called out to somewhere that God will show us, and we do not yet know. So friends, leave with this question in your heart. When that time comes, what will we choose?